Joining us right now, Jennifer Bevan Dangel. She's the Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland. Good to have you.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you guys have been at the forefront of redistricting in Maryland, trying to establish new redistricting guidelines. Tell me what happened last week with Governor Larry Hogan to move this cause along.
Last week, Governor Hogan followed through on a pledge he made during the State of the State in February, and he called for a study commission to look at Maryland's current process and recommend reforms.
Now, this was something that I know that many grassroots conservatives and, I shouldn't just make it a conservative issue, but many people in Maryland who feel like they don't have a true voice in Annapolis or in the U.S. Congress, they've been trying to push this along. Is Maryland one of the worst states when it comes to gerrymandering and carving out districts to protect incumbents?
Maryland is. There's different mathematical equations you can use to look at the districts and say how sprawled out they are. And by most of those mathematical formulas, Maryland ranks at the worst. Sometimes we're tied for worst with North Carolina, but we are certainly one of the greatest offenders for partisan and political reasons.
All right, now this is being touted as a bipartisan commission. Is it truly bipartisan?
It is. We were pleased to see co-chairs, one representing the Republican Party, one representing the Democratic Party. There are Republicans, Democrats, independents on the commission. And an interesting thing that we've discovered, when you go talk to regular people, regardless of party, the maps are so offensive that it just defies common sense. It is a bipartisan issue because anybody who wants to see their community fairly represented wants reform.
Now, I noticed with great interest, Mike Miller sort of held his fire and did not come out with all guns blazing about this. Is he on board with this idea so far?
We do anticipate more difficulties during the legislative session, making sure our leadership is truly on board with change. Even though there's incredible public support, usually this polls in the 80s to fix our system, we know that leadership likes the current system because they have a lot of power and influence, right. And it's always hard to take that away from someone.
All right, so what are you hoping this new commission will? I always get nervous when governors sign acts establishing commissions because I always feel like they get ignored and nothing happens and they have no power. What can really happen here?
The greatest fear is that report that sits on a shelf and looks pretty forever but doesn't do anything. But we're very optimistic with this one. In his State of the State, the governor mentioned his desire to see an independent body that would draw district lines. He has continued to follow through towards that, and there's enough grassroots pressure, enough groups on the ground fighting for change that we do anticipate legislation in the next session.
All right, so which is the most egregious, district in your mind, the way it's currently drawn?
District 3, which goes from Towson through Baltimore down to Montgomery County, across to Annapolis. That district has been called a broken-winged pterodactyl. It's been called the pinwheel of death. It's been called a blood splatter across the center of the state.
Jeez.
There is nothing pretty about that district.
It seems like when you start talking about from Towson, Baltimore, Annapolis, and Montgomery County.
Yeah, it's a bit much.
That's amazing.
Well, but also you can look at the district that Jan Bongino was so close to winning this last time around. That goes all the way to Western Maryland, but it also includes just enough of Montgomery County to sway the votes there. We saw the votes coming in, and Bongino was in the lead all night long until the last hour where they started counting the Montgomery County votes. That's really the concern here. Is it based? Are any of these districts right now, in your opinion, will they be able to draw these lines in such a way that it actually does reflect the feelings of the voters of the state of Maryland? You go to Western Maryland, it's like a whole different country.
Yes, and one of the reforms we've suggested in the past is just having contiguous standards so that the districts have to be more compact. They have to respect community lines. Having those standards for our federal districts, that alone would be a big step forward in making sure Western Maryland has a representative who can represent them in the eyes of most of the people out there.
How much does race factor into this? I know that there were concerns back in the day that when many lines were drawn to make sure that blacks and other minorities were represented, and so they drew districts to specifically make sure that much of that community was represented. Now you saw this decision in Virginia from the Supreme Court there that said that they've been isolating the black vote in these districts and drawing them to the exclusion of letting black voices be heard in other districts. Where does that stand now?
That is one of the only federal requirements that we do have to consider when we draw district lines. And by and large, Maryland does a good job respecting it. It is difficult because do you try to combine minority communities so that they have strong representation, or do you try to make sure that they're a strong part of multiple communities so that there's more broad representation? Making that choice is always a very complicated one. And although Maryland's maps have been taken to court on that issue, that they don't adequately represent minority communities, the judge did say that we had done a good enough job tackling that question. But it is one of the few federal requirements that we're always very careful of.
All right, so what's the timeline here, very quickly?
We anticipate public hearings September, October, hopefully a report from this study commission in November, legislation in January, and we hope people will make their voices heard when that happens.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much, Jennifer Bevan Dangel with Common Cause. It's good to have you here this morning.
Thank you to have me.